So up until this point, we have talked about how the new industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, changed the nature of work. I mean, what kind of industries it was expanded into, and a variety of new products that were being produced as a result. But I also want to talk a little bit about the political changes that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century as well, especially the connection between these new industrial jobs and some of the political parties that emerged across Europe. Quite basically, as industry grew, as more and more industries came into existence, so we get shipbuilding industries, chemical industries, automobile industries, factories. As these grew, naturally the number of workers who were employed in these factories and employed as a section of the industrial workforce grew as well. And over the course of the late 19th century, more and more of these people were becoming politically active at the same time. In order to protect their jobs, protect their working rights, many workers began to organize into trade unions. And it's worth bearing in mind that in Europe, in the middle of the 19th century, most countries had laws against the formation of trade union. And this was influenced by traditional liberal economic thought. The idea very simply being that a business owner should have no restrictions on his ability to run a business. Unions, for obvious reasons, put a clear restriction on his or her ability to run that business, and therefore the trade union should be made illegal. And some of the same language is used today. I mean, to this day, there are states that have that basically allow companies not to or prevent trade unions from forming, and those are called right to work states. So some of the same language is still used even in the 21st century about unions and what rights they should or should not have. The ability of workers to form unions in some ways depended upon their skill set. Workers that had some set of skills that were not easily replaced, they had tended to have more leverage, and they tended to be the ones who dominated the trade union industry simply because they had by going on strike, they had something that employers had leverage, had to reckon with, as opposed to unskilled workers who could simply be fired and replaced by someone else. So more and more workers are working in industry. More and more of those workers, especially those workers with skills, are beginning to organize in trade unions, oftentimes illegally doing so. But also bear in mind that as the franchise expanded, more and more of these workers also had votes. And political parties and governments had to respond by essentially giving into the demand of unions and allowing them legal rights to form as trade unions. And so we see this across Europe. In 1875, most of the restrictions that had existed on trade unions in the United Kingdom were lifted. In France, the same was true in 1884. If you remember going back to the early days of the French Revolution, there had been strict laws put in place, Chapelier laws, that made trade unions illegal. And that at the time made sense because the early stage of the French Revolution, it was liberals in the political and economic sense who took charge, and of course liberals in the 19th century definition of the word did not support trade unions. However, those laws were repealed in France in 1888 and were repealed in Germany in 1890. Germany being the most kind of conservative of the Western European states, not surprisingly, was kind of slower to give into trade unions. This also reflected, of course, the fact that workers had more and more political power. As we saw in the United Kingdom in our last lecture, the franchise was continually expanding in Britain in the late 19th century, and in France and Germany there was actually universal male suffrage, albeit in Germany at this time voters didn't have much influence on government, but nevertheless, in response to the demands of the workers, trade unionism was made legal in the industrialized countries of Europe. And of course, what did this lead to? It led to more and more strikes. And as workers had trained, by definition, by legalizing trade unions, governments also had to legalize strikes as a legitimate tactic in terms of demanding better pay and better conditions. What exactly did workers want? Usually an increase in wage was a pretty common demand, or to prevent some loss of right if the employer was trying to change their working conditions and workers felt their traditional rights were being infringed upon, they might strike. A big demand for workers in the late 19th century was a reduction of hours. One of the core centerpieces of trade union demands across Europe was the 8-hour day. What trade unionists basically argued was that people should work for 8 hours a day, have leisure time for 8 hours a day and then sleep for 8 hours a day. So there was a big push on for increasing or decreasing the amount of hours workers had to work. Workers could also be quite tactical in choosing their times to go on strike, oftentimes picking moments of weakness for their bosses. A common tactic, especially in big factories, was if a big order had just came in, the factory was under pressure to complete the order as quickly as possible. That was oftentimes seen as an ideal moment for workers to strike, knowing that they had increased leverage over their bosses. And as a result of this, as we'll see in the next slide as well, the workers of Europe became more and more important as a political voice, and eventually started organizing themselves into political parties as well. It's worth bearing in mind when we talk about workers' voices, workers being involved in politics, that left-wing politics amongst workers in the 19th century was divided basically in two. There were some who kind of adhered to Karl Marx's ideas, so we will say, for the sake of convenience, communists. And what they ultimately believed was that their working conditions would never improve until the state itself was overthrown. That is, that there's no point trying to work within the political system. We need to overthrow the political system and have a revolution. So that's what some workers believed, although that tended to be a minority position. Other workers were more kind of reform inclined, and maybe for sake of convenience we'll call them socialists. That is to say, they did not want to destroy the political system as such, but they wanted to reform from within to improve the working conditions for the workers, for the ordinary working classes of these various countries. So even as the political voice of the workers expands, it's rarely a single unified voice, because there's always divisions amongst the workers themselves about what exactly their end goal is. Is it reform of the democratic system in their country, or is it overthrow of the government and the installation of a socialist revolutionary regime? Obviously, as we'll see in a later class, it's the latter which eventually takes place in Russia, although in most European countries, reform-minded socialists tend to be the majority amongst workers. So, in rise with the growth of workers and the growth of the workers' franchise in particular, socialist politics become more and more important in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, and we will look at this in 3 different countries. Well, that's a mistake. Okay, so firstly in Germany, the single most effective workers' party in Europe in the 19th century was the Social Democratic Party of Germany. It was established in 1875. It quickly grew quite popular. In fact, Bismarck himself in Germany was so threatened by the rise of the Social Democratic Party that he actually tried to suppress the party, tried to ban the party, tried to ban its newspapers in the early years of its formation. And at its height, it's worth bearing in mind, the Social Democratic Party had over 100 newspapers and magazines. So it was certainly banning newspapers as one way to try and limit its appeal, as it tried to use the printed word to spread its message to the masses. However, these suppression tactics did not work. By 1884, 10% of the representatives in the German Reichstag, or Parliament, were members of the Social Democratic Party. This had increased to 35% by 1912, and by 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, the single largest party in the German Parliament was the Social Democratic Party. And this actually forced the German government to become more socialist in its own policies in order to try and undermine the political appeal of the Social Democratic Party. So even Bismarck, as socialist power began to grow, Bismarck realized it would be better to try and implement some of the Socialist Party's policies in order to prevent the party itself taking over government. So in 1889, Bismarck introduced state-funded old age pensions and disability pensions, as if once you retired from your job, you got a pension from the German government, or if you got hurt on the workplace, you were entitled to a disability pension. And I think that speaks to how socialist politics was changing the landscape of government in Europe in the 19th century, that it was Bismarck, the arch-conservative of Europe in the 19th century, who was forced to essentially take the first steps towards a welfare state in Germany because he doesn't want the Social Democratic Party to grow in power. So the Social Democratic Party was the biggest of the European political parties, Labour or working class parties. It certainly wasn't the only one. In Britain, as we've seen, has a two-party system in the 19th century. That was the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party, which had pushed for more and more expanded franchise, initially benefited from that, as the new voters who were enfranchised tended to be more liberal in their politics. But over time, some of the workers of Britain began to feel that the Liberal Party was a bit too middle class and did not have the best interests of the working class, or didn't have the best interests of the working class at centre of its vision. So what we saw in Britain was in the 1880s, there was something called the Fabian Society. Was established, which was the basic goal of the Fabian Society was to promote an improvement of the living and working conditions of the working class. They took the name Fabian Society from the Roman general Fabius, who I actually mentioned in an earlier class about Napoleon Bonaparte. Fabius was the Roman general who refused to fight against Hannibal of Carthage when he invaded Rome during the Punic Wars, basically because he thought Hannibal was too effective, that fighting open battles was playing to Hannibal's strength, and therefore it would be better to hold off, not engage in an all or nothing battle, and bide your time and wear down the enemy. And in some ways that's what the Fabian Society was proposing for the working classes in the late 19th century United Kingdom. What they were basically suggesting was that we are not going to try and advocate socialist revolution that will change things overnight. Rather, we are trying to promote gradual change, gradual improvement through the established democratic political means. From the Fabian Society, a political party was established in 1895 called the British Labour Party. Its first member of Parliament was the guy pictured here, Keir Hardie. He was the first independent working man elected to Parliament in 1892. And by 1906, the Labour Party had 29 members of Parliament. That wasn't a giant. I mean, the British Parliament at the time had about 600 members, so 29 members, you're looking at about 5%. Initially, they were relatively small, but over the course of the 20th century, in fact, quite early, by the 1920s, the Labour Party had overtaken the Liberal Party as the second party of the two-party British political system, and had remained so pretty much up until the last 7 or 8 years in our time. It's also worth noting that one of the important changes that the introduction of working class members of Parliament resulted in was that you now had to start paying members of Parliament. Traditionally, members of Parliament were not paid, and that naturally meant that only people from a wealthy background or a reasonably well-off background who could afford to devote their time to sitting in Parliament without getting paid could do so. But once working class men were elected to Parliament in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the laws had to be changed in order to provide a wage for members of Parliament. So that's where the idea of actually paying politicians arises from. France was the third country. Oh, sorry, let me finish on and as in Britain, as in Germany, we saw that Liberal Party politics had to change in response. That the British Liberal Party, just as Bismarck did in Germany, had to change its own policies in order to try and stop the growth of working class votes, or more specifically, to try and attract those working class votes to the Liberal Party, as opposed to allowing them go to the new Labour Party. So they, in 1909, introduced new laws regulating certain trades, and passed the National Insurance Act in 1911, which provided again for state pensions, disability pensions, old age pensions, socialist politics being adopted by the Liberal Party in order to try and increase its appeal to working class voters. We saw something similar in France, although while socialism was a very powerful force in France, what was noted about French socialist politics is that there was still a big divide between the communists who wanted to overthrow the political system and the socialists who wanted to reform it. So the French political left, unlike in Britain, unlike in Germany, actually remained kind of split in two. Nevertheless, even the fact that the political left was divided, by 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, the Socialist Party was the second biggest political party in France. And so the Social Democratic Party in Germany was the biggest party on the outbreak of war. The Socialist Party was the second biggest party in France. And clearly, the Second Industrial Revolution has helped promote and push working class politics front and centre of the political scene in Europe by the early 20th century.